Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, speedy SSDs, and a 40 gigabit public network, you get everything you need to run a fast, reliable, and bulletproof data platform. And if you need global distribution, they've got that covered too with worldwide data centers, including new ones in Toronto and one opening in Mumbai at the end of the year. And for your machine learning workloads, they just announced dedicated CPU instances, where you get to take advantage of their blazing fast compute units. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode, today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And to keep track of how your team is progressing on building new pipelines and tuning their workflows, you need a project management system designed by engineers for engineers. Clubhouse lets you craft a workflow that fits your style, including per-team tasks, cross-project epics, a large suite of pre-built integrations, and a simple API for crafting your own. With such an intuitive tool, it's easy to make sure that everyone in the business is on the same page, and Data Engineering Podcast listeners get 2 months free on any plan by going to dataengineeringpodcast.com/clubhouse today and signing up for a free trial. Support the show and get your data projects in order. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with what's happening in databases, streaming platforms, big data, and everything else you need to know about modern data management. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Dataversity, and the Open Data Science Conference, and coming up this fall are the combined events of Graphorum and the Data Architecture Summit in Chicago. The agendas have been announced, and Super Early Bird registration is available until July 26th for up to $300 off. Or you can get the early bird pricing until August 30th for $200 off your ticket. Use the code BNLLC to get an additional 10% off any pass when you register. And go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/conferences to learn more and to take advantage of our partner discounts when you register for this and other events. And you can go to dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Aaron Gibralter and Raghu Murthy about the experience of Greenhouse migrating their data pipelines to DataCoral. So, Aaron, could you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Tobias. Thank you for having me. Yeah, again, my name is Aaron Gibralter. I'm one of the directors of engineering here at Greenhouse. I work with two different teams. I'm both on the product engineering side, running a team building one of our products, and I also work with our data science and data engineering teams. Greenhouse is a talent acquisition suite that helps companies acquire and retain the best talent. And yeah, I guess as is the case for most companies these days that build software, data is incredibly important to us.
And Raghu, could you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Raghu Murthy. I'm the founder and CEO of DataCoral, a company where we are automating the building of data pipelines, and we have built it in such a way that it's all serverless. We have been working with Greenhouse over the past couple of years, so I'm really excited about the conversation where we're able to kind of just take folk through the journey that Greenhouse went through while we were growing and while they were getting started on using their data as well.
And also for anybody who wants to dig deeper into DataCoral itself and your experience of building and growing that company, I'll refer them back to the other interview that we did with you, and I'll add a link to that in the show notes. And so going back to you again, Aaron, do you remember how you first got involved in the area of data management?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an interesting story for me. As I mentioned before, I work with two different teams and two different disciplines. Product engineering and data are a bit different. And so the data piece was a little bit more happenstance. I think when I joined Greenhouse 4 years ago, and not too long into my tenure, my boss, now our CTO, the VP of engineering at the time, Mike Before, asked me to step in and get involved with our data scientists. At the time, we had one. His name is Andrew Zerm. He came from academia. He was a astrophysics professor, PhD, and he had gone through one of the data science accelerator or boot camps to kind of transition from academia to the business world. And so he joined Greenhouse and kind of has started building out some of the data pipelines that we used to wrangle the data, and also started to build out our reporting and analytics capabilities, and as well as some machine learning stuff. But he was alone working on the team, and Mike Buford asked me to start to work with him to think about different use cases. And so that's how I got involved. It was kind of a need the company had. I had a little bit of spare bandwidth at the time, and so it was just luck in a sense, but it's definitely become a huge interest for me, and I've become quite passionate about both the data science and data engineering side.
And Raghu, for anyone who hasn't listened to your prior interview, can you share again how you first got introduced to the area of data management?
Yeah, so I've been an engineer working on data infrastructure and distributed systems for a while, starting back in the day to automate all the data pipelines that typically need to get built out for these teams.
And so going back to you, Aaron, you mentioned a bit about what it is that Greenhouse does. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit more about some of the ways that you use data within the business and your overall data infrastructure as it was before you made the move to DataCoral.
Sure. It's interesting. I think we've come a long way. As I mentioned, Greenhouse is a talent acquisition suite. We have a number of different products that help companies with their hiring and onboarding process. I think it's SaaS software, so companies buy our software, and then it's provided through the web. And as a result, I mean, I don't want to sound like it's unique to us. Like, I think pretty much any software company now generates a ton of data, every user interaction, and kind of the state of the database at any given time has a lot of meaning. And so for us, the use cases for data, which is kind of like this big amorphous blob term, kind of spans the gamut from kind of us understanding our customers and how much value they're getting out of our platform, to helping our customers understand their own data even better, and kind of everything in between. The state of our data pipelines before DataCoral were kind of, as I mentioned, we had one data scientist who is a little bit of he's a polymath, he's a generalist. He's always been interested in everything from the infrastructure side to the modeling side. And so he actually dug in and ended up building out our ETLs himself. And so I think what our infrastructure team did at the time, this is 3 or 4 years ago, is they set up an EC2 instance for him in our VPC and gave him his own RDS and said, do whatever you want, go to town. And so he stood up Airflow there and built out a series of ETLs to start to pull data from our production databases, are just connecting to our followers and in our infrastructure, and just pulled data out and reshaped it into the data science warehouse, which was his RDS. And then he connected a BI tool. I think at the time we were using Periscope. And so started to build dashboards on top of it so that we could understand our customers' behavior. And we had a feature at the time, I think it was called the Matrix. And the idea was it was kind of like a matrix of every feature in our product and every customer, and like checkboxes on what, which features which customers were using. And that gave both our product team and our customer success team a better understanding of, the lay of the land. And so that was kind of the first stage in exposing this data. I think, just going back to your question, what the use cases now have expanded. The company is much bigger. And I think we've even gone into building predictive features for our customers. So we have a feature in our product called Greenhouse Predicts. And what it does is it looks at the status of a particular job pipeline, how many candidates are in every stage, how many candidates are in application review, initial screen, phone screen, onsite, and so on. And we built a model to predict when we expect a hire to be made. And so that's a feature that we offer to our customers. And so that requires us, to train the model. We pull data out of our data warehouse in a particular shape, and then we build the model, train it, and then have deployed an inference engine to allow our application to make those predictions. Those are kind of the range of cases that we have. But most of, as I mentioned before, most of it was ad hoc, like point-to-point ETLs before DataCoral. I know that was a bit of a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that was great. And just to get a bit of a flavor too, I'm curious about the just overall team size and structure that you're working with for the data engineer versus data science breakdown, and the sort of overall number of customers for that infrastructure.
Sure. And by customers, do you mean
internal users?
So when we started, as I mentioned, we literally just had one data scientist with some support from product engineering and infrastructure doing everything. So at the time when I joined the company, it was 4 years ago, I think our engineering team was probably around 20 to 30 people, and the whole company was around 70 people. And we had one data scientist doing everything. And now the company's 300 or over 300, and our engineering team is 70 to 100. It's always hard to keep track with how much we're growing, but we still have a pretty small data science team. And I'll go into this a bit more later on, but I think what DataCoral has provided us is it gives us the ability to punch above our weight class in terms of our data science team and what we're able to provide. So we have no data engineers at Greenhouse. We have some teams that help with data engineering, but we have no dedicated data engineers. And we have 2 data scientists, and we're growing right now. So we'll be bringing on another, let's say, 2 to 3 data scientists this year. And with no expectation or need to hire any data engineers to support that, and largely in part because DataCoral gives us the tools to manage it ourselves without needing to handle the infrastructure. The number of internal stakeholders we have is grown a lot. We've predominantly started with customer success as our main stakeholder, but we have moved into working a lot with marketing, finance, sales, support, and engineering, R&D. So understanding our own site performance, kind of our engineering throughput, our product OKRs. So while there's so much that we can do and so much more that we can do, and that's why we're growing, I think, as I said, I think we're able to punch above our weight class and do a lot more because we've adopted DataCoral, and it provides us a lot of leverage.
And can you talk through a bit more about the types of data sources that you're working with for pulling into your data warehouses and into your analytics?
Sure. At first, when we managed our own ETLs, it was mainly just our production database. So we run Postgres as our main production database for our application. So it was mainly pulling data out of that about what our customers, were doing in the product, like what data artifacts are being left over from user interactions. And I think we may have built out some Salesforce ETLs to pull data from Salesforce, because Salesforce is a source of truth around customer information, like key points of contact and segmentation, like industry size, or what industry the company is in, or where what their address is for like company location. So those things we were pulling from Salesforce. And now we pull in from a lot of sources into our data warehouse with DataCoral. So the main sources we have, again, the production database is probably the most important, but we also pull in Salesforce data, Zendesk data, Jira. And so now, Salesforce, Zendesk, and the production database are all more customer data, whereas Jira is our kind of internal data, what cards were shipped, what features we're shipping and how quickly. And so now we're actually going deeper into that, pulling data from Datadog and Asana, so other project management software. And so that's been incredibly helpful too to have in our warehouse.
Yeah, being able to correlate sort of general usage patterns with when a specific feature might have been shipped, I can definitely see as being very valuable.
Exactly.
And so, in terms of the data pipeline as it existed, sort of leading up to the point where you started looking around for alternatives, I'm curious what were the biggest pain points that you were dealing with and the ultimate motivation that led you to reevaluate your approach to the ETL processes that you were managing?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of things that led to the reevaluation. I think the biggest pain points were, I think at the time our team was quite small, so it was just one person. So there was a lot of concern around a single point of failure. All these ETLs being built out in kind of like a custom way, with one person building them. If something, we always talk about bus factor in engineering. I like to maybe think about more like the lotto factor or something a little less dark. But for some reason, Andrew, if he decided to leave, I think we would have been in a really bad state. There's very little. He was kind of working in his own world. We even called his part of our VPC. His last name is, as I mentioned, is Andrew Zerm. We called it VPZ, Virtual Private Zerm. And whenever you have something like that, it kind of raises. It's a bit of a organization smell or a robustness smell. And so one of the biggest pain points was that idea of the single point of failure. The other thing is maintenance of it was taking up a fair amount of his time. Ideally, a data scientist should be spending most of his or her time in some sort of leverage capacity around data, as opposed to working on the plumbing. And so, I think probably at the time I would have to, ask him. But my impression was that he spent between 25% and at maybe the worst times 50% of his time kind of wrangling data, as opposed to spending it on analysis or predictive pieces. So that was definitely a big pain point, was how much time we were investing in it.
And so once you came to the point where you decided that the current state of affairs wasn't really going to be tenable in the long run, I'm curious what your criteria were for determining what a replacement would look like, whether that was a build versus buy decision, or if you were looking at bringing on dedicated data engineers on staff and the types of tools that they might be interested in, and just the overall process of going through that evaluation and then the ultimate decision-making process.
Yeah, I think it. The way you put it there is a generous way. I think in some ways it was less intentional, and in many ways we got lucky. So I think things were working. I think in some sense the main costs or pain points were opportunity costs. I think because I was new to the field, I didn't really know what good looked like. So I think we were okay in some ways with the status quo. And I think luckily we had an advisor through one of our investors that would speak with Andrew on a regular cadence. And he mentioned that we should consider looking at DataCoral and thinking about our data stack. And so it was through that we started to explore it and realized kind of what the possibilities would be. But in some ways, I wish that we had been more intentional earlier on in saying, hey, what does this look like a year from now? But I think we were just kind of treading water and doing the best we could with the situation. And so I do think that in retrospect, if I were to do it again, I'd have a much better perspective on efficiency and where we're spending our time, and what leverage looks like. But I think ultimately we got lucky in that DataCoral kind of came along, and we were also I think it was also very early in data. It was, very early in DataCoral's existence as well. So it was kind of like a, fortuitous moment, or, it was just luck that we kind of found each other at the right time, and we could grow together and get to a much better place.
And so after you got introduced to Raghu and DataCoral and made the decision that you were going to replace your existing pipeline with what DataCoral was building, can you talk through what your overall experience was of getting onboarded and making the cutover and determining the sort of data quality, ensuring that it matched what you were already getting, or that it was improved, and the overall experience of sort of drawing down the previous infrastructure in favor of DataCoral?
Yeah, definitely. I think another, just going back a little bit, another big piece in terms of our evaluation criteria, I think the one thing we knew all along was that we never wanted our data to leave our VPC. I think, as is the case with a lot of companies, I mean, maybe not, but we care a lot about the security and compliance piece for us is of extreme importance. We have a lot of very sensitive information at Greenhouse, and we obviously, we would never use our customers' data in a way that we weren't explicit about. And so one piece there is that we knew that in any world, it was either something we would have to build internally, but the idea of a vendor where we would actually have to pipe data into someone else's warehouse or through someone else's pipes was not really an option. And so that was, I think, DataCoral was built that with the idea that the data stays in your own infrastructure from the start. And so I think when we found that out, that's kind of one of the barriers, like one of those barriers to entry was immediately lowered. And it was something that we were interested in testing out. And so I think, I think that was a really important piece in the evaluation process and allowed us to test out a use case without like moving mountains. Because I think right now, every time we add a sub-processor, it kind of has to go into all the contracts, or all the customers have to be made aware that their data is going to, be, and we have a number of, we use AWS. So like, I think it's not possible. We're not like building our own hardware and doing everything on-prem. And so it's not crazy that we would send or use a vendor to achieve something, achieve some value for our customers. But in this particular use case, we knew that we wanted to keep the data flow in our own VPC. So when we were talking about the cutover process and using DataCoral, I think it was quite easy for us. We did a security and compliance review to make sure that kind of all the cloud formation templates that DataCoral was handing us and all the stuff that they were providing us was sound. But beyond that, I think it was easier for us to give it a try because we knew that it was running in our own infrastructure. And so that was kind of the lens that we used, is like, hey, we can stand this up. Let's try it out and see how it works. And if it seems like it's worthwhile, or if it's easy and provides value to us, then we'll continue. And if not, we can easily spin it down and undo that. And so that was a pretty easy way for us internally to evaluate it. And I think I talked to Raghu a bit about this, but because we started using DataCoral very early in DataCoral's existence, I think that the cutover process was definitely not cut and dry. I think there was a lot of us working together to figure out the solutions to our problems, but I think we got to a really amazing place. And I think that process now for a company evaluating DataCoral would be quite different. I think DataCoral's quite mature now. And so I think that process, whatever I say here would be very different for someone trying it out now. But yeah, that cutover process probably took, I don't know, Raghu, do you have a sense of that? Is probably over the course of a year that we adopted DataCoral, and then we're finally able to sunset our existing ETLs. Maybe even longer than that before we sunset our existing ETLs. But I think that if we did it today, it would be much faster.
Yeah, so maybe I can add a few things here. So we started talking to Greenhouse very, very early on in our existence. And clearly my goal at that point in time was to see the kind of the architecture that I had come up with and we were kind of working on, would that actually make sense? And the great thing about Greenhouse has been, as you can imagine, for an early stage company, the most valuable thing is time from potential customers and patience. So they were kind of, Aaron and his team, they were convinced about the architecture. And as you mentioned, the fact that we are running within their VPC lowered the barrier to entry for them to actually try it out. And then just like what we do even now for our existing customers, it started off as like one use case. I think the first use case was to pull data from their production environment and move it into a data warehouse, Redshift in this case, and essentially get Andrew Zerm out of kind of having to query like a follower database of the production data of the follower of the production database, or like have him kind of do anything kind of in an ad hoc manner. Instead, it is actually a better thing to have him just focus on doing the analysis itself, and he could do that directly on Redshift. So that was kind of the first take for us, to just kind of replicate one data source. And then slowly but surely, we started adding more and more connectors. And like Aaron mentioned before, they're kind of pulling from Salesforce, Zendesk, Jira, and all. Now I think at least I have lost track of the number of different sources from which they're collecting data. But in terms of the cutover period, like the way that typically happens, right, is that if companies typically have something already that is kind of processing their data, they don't want to just rip and replace everything, because that actually is much harder to do. Instead, the better thing to do is to kind of take one use case and actually make it work. And our whole kind of microservices based architecture means that we can live alongside whatever companies might have. So as more and more use cases came along where people were able to just use DataCoral directly instead of whatever they had originally, so there were net new use cases that were being directly worked on in using DataCoral. And of course, the existing stuff can be moved, or you can kind of keep it around or sunset them, or however you want to plan it out. The goal for DataCoral is to make sure that whatever use cases you want to actually move, those are the ones that we can actually make super easy. And again, very early on in our engagement with Greenhouse, given that we had essentially like an overall idea of the architecture and like an initial kind of pre-alpha even implementation, we did kind of go through a lot of learnings while working with Greenhouse, and even the whole kind of the security architecture and stuff like that. I mean, we work pretty closely with Greenhouse to get it to a point where not only that their security team was happy with it, but we were able to leverage that work and get a lot out of it, even with our other customers, or even while working with AWS to get to the advanced technology partnership. There's a whole set of questions in the questionnaire, as you can imagine, when you're trying to get through these compliances or these kind of partnership levels around security and whether you're a data processor. All of those questions essentially were kind of completely irrelevant to us, because all of our software was running within the customer VPC.
Yeah, the security piece, I think we worked through very closely together. As I said, security is of utmost concern to us. And so I think that was the hardest part of getting started with DataCoral, not in a bad way, but we just had to figure out an architecture that made sense such that DataCoral would not have access to any of the underlying data. And we were able to get there. And so it was really a great experience working with DataCoral to make sure that that was the case. And I'm glad that it has contributed, and I'm happy that it contributed to kind of the overall, like the standard architecture for how DataCoral does these engagements.
And Raghu, I'm also curious about some of the sort of edge cases or sort of sharp points in your infrastructure and architecture that ended up getting ironed out in the process of onboarding Aaron and Greenhouse and any of the other customers that you were working with in the sort of similar time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the main things that you realize after kind of when you're building a system and then getting a bunch of customers, at least initial users of the platform or like the system, is that there are, as you said, like sharp edges, right? So it's very easy to get into bad states. The amount of error checking or like error propagation, kind of, you don't pay as much attention to it early on because you're mainly trying to establish the viability of the technology overall. So for the most part, like at least initially, we would have to handhold customers through kind of setting up DataCoral, like setting up these connectors. And then as the data was kind of flowing, they would be able to kind of fend for themselves. But then if there were errors and stuff like that, instead of them knowing about it through like a tool or whatever, they might kind of run into problems because, hey, the data is not fresh. What happened? So we had like a Slack channel where people could just ping us. And along the way, we have clearly made our overall platform a lot more robust. We have gotten to a point where our customers typically don't have to kind of actually worry about kind of data quality. We kind of catch errors sooner than anybody else can actually kind of notice it. We are able to fix them. And again, all of this is happening because we're providing this whole kind of automated data pipelines as a service. right? So we use this notion of a cross-account role that allows us to monitor everything that's happening in the customer in the installation while still not having access to any of the data. The data itself is encrypted using keys that our roles don't have access to. So this whole combination of providing like a SaaS offering, but within the customer VPC, I think that has allowed us to, in some sense, give ourselves the time to build out the automation while still kind of using operations to make sure that everything is actually working well.
And I don't know if you want me to go into these details, Raghu, but I think there's some interesting, like getting into the nuts and bolts. One of the pain points we ran into, I think the original ETL system that DataCoral was working with, and frankly, what similar to what we had going in our own Airflow ETLs, was this concept of pulling data out by the updated at column. We have timestamp columns in our Postgres database that presumably say the last time the row was touched. Unfortunately for us, our application, the timestamp columns are not trigger based in our database. So it's up to the application or the query writer to always update the timestamp at the update time. And so we found that there were actually cases of bulk updates that we did that would affect a large number of rows, but not touch the updated at timestamp. And so we actually had data quality issues or data consistency issues between our production database and our warehouse, where certain rows would be different in the production database than we're displaying in our data warehouse. And this led to a number of pain points in our analyses where, especially around candidate pipelines, things like application stages application stages is a good example of like kind of the presence of a candidate at a given stage. Some of those would get updated in bulk and then not be updated in our data warehouse. So our warehouse would say something about the state of the pipeline, but it would not be accurate. And this is something that we ran into with DataCoral as well, because their original ETLs were based on polling and using the updated at timestamp. And so we realized that with DataCoral and went through a number of different strategies to try and fix this. One involved adding triggers to our production database to make the timestamps be automatic. But the more that we thought about this, the more that our team was worried about actually implementing something so heavy in our database just for the purpose of our ETLs in our data warehouse. So we ultimately decided to not go the route of implementing these triggers or custom stored procedures in Postgres, and instead started to think about using logical decoding to stream changes from our database. And so that's ultimately the path that we went down, and DataCoral did too. And I think we've been extremely happy with the results. But that's an example of kind of some of the work we did together to try and figure out the best way to get data out efficiently and consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a great example where for us, it was kind of Greenhouse pushing us to kind of get to the next level. And we were kind of building it as we kind of had these conversations with them. And again, having a customer who is able to kind of work through these kinds of situations or these kinds of problems is actually incredibly valuable for an early stage company. And also, I think the timing was right. This was around the same time that RDS in Amazon was starting to support logical decoding. We were able to just leverage that and be able to kind of provide a serverless way of actually pulling all the changes from these databases and be able to apply the changes in the warehouse.
And so once you made the cutover and started using DataCoral more full-time and were getting ready to sunset your existing infrastructure, what were your evaluation criteria for determining that the data quality was sufficient, that you were able to replicate all of the prior capabilities, and that everybody was able to do the work that they needed to do once you had made the cutover?
So yeah, as to your question about kind of the big, this is the kind of the big wins or knowing, when things are ready. I think it was, as I said a little bit before, it was a bit of a gradual process for us. So most of what we were building in this test phase with DataCoral were new, kind of new analyses or new reports. So I think it was really once we were confident that the new reports had happy customers that we knew that we could kind of cut over everything. So the specific example, we have this. I think the main kind of one of the guinea pig projects that we took was we have this this set of dashboards that we call I think it was originally called the QBR deck. Now it's an EBR. So QBRs are quarterly business reviews. EBR means executive business review. I think it's a pretty common concept in SaaS enterprise companies where an account manager or a customer success manager will sit down with a customer and talk about, hey, how are things going? And how can we make sure that you are achieving your goals as a company? And how can you use our product to achieve those goals? So it's a pretty common concept in the world that we, in SaaS software. And so we had our original EBR deck powered by those original ETLs. And so that's where we would often run into these data inconsistencies that I was talking about before. And so what we decided to do was build out the new EBR dashboard, which again would be the dashboard in our BI tool that a CSM would use to generate the charts for their specific customers that they would then either print out as a PDF or copy and paste into a PowerPoint presentation to talk about with those customers. So we decided to rebuild that using the DataCoral materialized views and the DataCoral data. And so that was kind of one of the big first use cases. And it was something that I think went over pretty successfully, and we were able to get a team of dozens of customer success managers to use. And so once that was up and running, and they weren't using the old one anymore, that was kind of a signal to us that we could start to use DataCoral for more of these kinds of workflows. So the next one, which was pretty big, is we automated our financial reporting. So taking data from our transactional financial system with all the kind of line items of what our customers are paying for, and reconciling that with Salesforce, all in SQL through a series of materialized views that then create a dashboard for our finance team to basically build what we call the ARR momentum report, which is our annual recurring revenue momentum report that shows how much our customers are paying us, what is changing over time, and breaking that down by segment and slicing and dicing it different ways, and then allowing them to kind of download a copy of that data from our BI tool that they can then pull into Excel, massage more to understand in different ways, is a huge win, and our finance team is super happy with it. There's another use case that also involves the customer success team. As I mentioned before, one of our biggest stakeholders is our customer success team. This customer success team here at Greenhouse uses a tool called Tatango to manage relationships with customers. It's kind of a CRM type tool specifically for customer success, and basically it helps automate keeping tabs on customers' health and automating communication with the customers, like sending out email communications and surveys and other things like that. And the way that Tatango works is in order to understand customer health, you have to give it data about your customers. And so there are kind of two main ways to do that. They have a JavaScript library you can throw on your page, and you kind of give it some JavaScript instructions, and it will instrument your application and kind of track your customers. And Tatango also has an API where you can send it events from a server, from a backend. And so when we were evaluating Tatango, and this is kind of me wearing my product engineering hat, as a product engineer, I'm always very hesitant to throw third-party dependencies into kind of core product workflows. As much as possible, I like to avoid putting additional JavaScript on a page that can either have errors or cause load time to increase, or you're essentially running someone else's software or someone else's code on your page. And so that always makes me nervous. So I knew that including the Tatango JavaScript on our page was not something I was a fan of. And so something that I discouraged our our team from doing. And I mentioned that during our discovery phase with Tatango. And so the obvious next choice is to pipe data in through the API. So basically Tatango has an API, and you can say, here is an event, this thing happened, customer navigated to this page, or customer made a hire in our software, and so that would contribute to the health score. And here again, one of the naive implementation, I think, would be to actually litter the code base itself, our production code, with calls, instrumentation calls to Tatango, in the controller that handles a hire being made in Greenhouse. We could fire off an event to Tatango to say, hey, a hire was just made. But that would mean that our code base would start to get littered with this instrumentation that we would then have to maintain over time. And as behavior changed, we would have to change. And to me, that seemed like a very bad idea as well. So I immediately suggested that actually, instead of this being a product engineering problem, I would shift it onto the data side, to the data science, data engineering side. And so DataCoral has a Tatango publishing slice that allows us to send data to that Tatango API. But what's nice for us is we don't have to worry about what that API looks like. What shape of data they want is really all that matters. And it's actually what shape DataCoral expects that data to be in, such that it can send it to Tatango. And so what we're able to do is write a series of materialized views to transform the data into the right shape, and DataCoral handles the rest. It will periodically push those events to Tatango, and everything is kind of handled asynchronously and doesn't interrupt any of the product. And the product engineers actually don't even worry about this. They don't think about it, and it's really nice for them not to have that on their mind at all. So this is kind of a fantastic use case where we have data and we want to send it to some other system, and so we can transform it and send it to that system without interrupting, without getting in the way of any other work.
And so now that you have been using DataCoral for a while and you're able to get all of your ETL processes done just using their capabilities without having to have any dedicated data engineers, I'm wondering, one, sort of how you would characterize the overall experience of yourself and the people who are directly working with DataCoral, and the ways that you're using the time that you freed up with trying to maintain your prior ETL pipelines.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think for the most part, the experience of the people on my team working with DataCoral has been great. I think we've had a good working relationship, and I think there have been times where we've had to work through some stuff that was not ready. And as Raghu mentioned, the experience that we've had is probably a unique one, having grown with DataCoral. But I think overall, it's really easy for someone a data scientist on our team to think about the data flows in the form of like SQL transformations, essentially materialized views. It's really kind of a common, like a lingua franca, or like a common language that SQL is really easy for us to all understand. And having data go from one table to another, as opposed to kind of flowing through hard to define scripts or transformations that aren't so straightforward, makes the whole system really approachable for both our team and our collaborators. So even the slightly less technical folks embedded within the stakeholders, like the people that work in CS operations or marketing operations or sales operations, we can talk to them about materialized views and collaborate on what those should look like, and what the shape the data should be in, and it all kind of makes sense to everyone, as opposed to being this black box of data flowing in all sorts of directions. And I think in terms of what we're doing with that spare time, I think we can basically pour that back into the higher leveraged activities like analyses or even predictive analytics. I think on the data engineering side, the people within our organization, the engineers that have helped with data engineering over the years, have been able to, rather than being dedicated data engineers, are able to work on other parts of our internal tooling system that is a bit higher leverage. For example, our CI/CD platform We know how code gets from a developer's machine to production. We've built out an actual internal pass here at Greenhouse where we are able to deploy to ephemeral dev environments, and engineers that join our team, product engineers that join our team, are kind of awestruck with some of the processes we have that allow this really easy testing and staging on the fly. And so I think we invested a lot in that, and we've been able to invest a lot in that because we don't have to work on data engineering. I think I'm not going to chalk it all up to that. Like, I think there are a lot of other pieces to the puzzle, but I think just in short, as I said before, not having to worry about these ETLs allows us to focus on higher leverage activities.
And just wondering if you can also quickly talk through what the current workflow looks like for building and maintaining the data flows that you're deploying onto the DataCoral platform, and just what the interaction pattern looks like, and how you're managing and organizing the code that you're deploying for managing those data flows, and how you ensure sort of discoverability or visibility of what the flows are.
That's a fantastic question. That's kind of like the next. I think that's one of the next big things for our team as we scale, as we hire more data scientists. That's going to be of extreme importance for us to have that discoverability and that structure that makes sense. Because if we don't, I think there's going to be a lot of rework or stepping on each other's toes. I think this is also an area that DataCoral is working on, and it's another piece that I feel like I know that we feel that DataCoral's working on this a lot, and I hope that they feel that we're contributing again on this front in terms of feedback. But I think there's some work to do here in terms of how to standardize these workflows. So to get into the nuts and bolts, basically DataCoral provides a CLI tool. You run DataCoral and then a command like DataCoral organize, and then you can say mat view, materialized view, create, and then you specify a path to a file, a .dpl file, data programming language file, that's essentially a SQL command, and with some comments and some annotations on the top of it that say, what kind of a materialized view it is, and what is the frequency with which it should be refreshed, and so on. And so that SQL file is kind of like the source of, that is the transformation that's going to happen. And so in a naive world, you basically have people just write some SQL and then run it through the CLI and create these mat views. Obviously, we want to be doing code review. We want to have, someone, if someone's going to create a new materialized view, we want someone else to approve it, and we want it all under version control. So we have a single Git repository called DataCoral that contains all of our materialized views in a structure that makes sense to us. So we basically have the different schemas as top-level directories. So you can imagine a schema roughly correlated with a kind of a use case. So you could say like analytics _CS, so like customer success analytics. All the materialized views that power the dashboards that the CS team uses, all the materialized views there are in that directory, in that schema. But what we've had to do is write some, make files or scripts to kind of make the process a little bit more streamlined. And then I think there's the risk that we don't have any kind of CI, continuous integration or continuous deployment of these things. So we still have to run them manually. So even when we open a pull request, we've had to come up with our own process where we'll open a pull request, say, hey, I'm going to create this materialized view. Can someone take a look at it? And once it's approved, then I use the CLI to deploy it. But there's no, it's not being enforced and it's not being automated. And I'd love to get there, but I think in some ways, there's some work for us to do. And in some ways, there's work that DataCoral is doing to make this a bit more streamlined as well.
Yeah, so just to kind of give an example, yet another example of kind of how Greenhouse is helping us move forward on this. So one of the things that we have done right now is this whole kind of compile step. So earlier, people would be able to just kind of create these materialized views, and we would kind of automatically infer the dependencies and kind of generate the pipelines. But now with these kind of DPL files that are all kind of in one kind of repository, when you're trying to update one of those materialized views, you should be able to kind of run a compile step that will then tell you if there's anything downstream that might actually get affected. right? Because we know what the data dependencies are. And again, with Greenhouse kind of leading the way in terms of providing the right kinds of use cases, we've been able to kind of get started on that compile step. And then the idea would be that would actually provide like a CI/CD pipeline where you change kind of like one materialized view somewhere in the middle of the DAG, and then you should be able to not only push it to production, but be able to kind of run it in like a test mode from that node all the way downstream, so that you know what the difference is going to be like after the test has been so after the change actually has been applied. So these are actually things that we are actively working on, and again, with Greenhouse helping lead the way in terms of providing the right kinds of use cases.
And so, as you continue to work with DataCoral and Raghu, as you continue to work with Greenhouse, I'm wondering what you're hoping to see in the future in terms of the platform evolution, or any plans that you have going forward to add new capabilities or capacity to DataCoral.
Yeah, I think that the piece that we were just talking about is one part of it, kind of the operationalization, productionizing, in those words. Basically, like making this whole process scale and be discoverable, and this the data warehouse is becoming its own production system. And with any production system, you want some sort of a staged approach to change management. You don't want to just be doing it live. So what we just talked about with the kind of the different tools that can help kind of stage a change to the data pipeline, and show that that's a big piece of what I'm kind of looking forward to in the future. And I think on the other end of the spectrum is more, while SQL is an incredible way to express these data transformations, I think there are some use cases where things are a little bit more complicated, or you might want to do something a bit more advanced. I think Raghu will probably speak more towards this, but I think building more sophisticated data transformations using the same system will be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, so to basically add to kind of what Aaron mentioned, one of the things that we are hearing from Greenhouse and other customers is that they'd like to move beyond SQL to be able to kind of specify more complicated transformations. But we really like the whole set of abstractions that SQL provides around kind of explicit data dependency specification, as well as kind of the abstraction around just saying, okay, what do you want to get done, not how. So we have come up with this abstraction called the user-defined table generation function. Again, this is not new. Query engines like Hive have had it for a long time. But we have come up with a way where people can actually plug in their Python code to be able to do kind of much more complicated transformations, even do things like inference, batched inference, and things like that. And you should be able to plug that into a data flow, and the data flow specification itself is done in SQL, because I mean that's how we are able to infer the data dependencies that will then generate the data pipelines. So this is one of the features that we are actually super excited about, because that will hopefully allow data scientists to do a lot more than just write SQL.
And are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Greenhouse, or the work that you're doing at DataCoral, or the sort of interaction between the two companies that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I think maybe Aaron, you can talk about kind of the business requirement, and uh, Tobias, just to kind of point out here, this was one of the big use cases that Aaron and I had talked about earlier, but we didn't kind of get to it in terms of, I guess, the big wins aspect. This is around GDPR. So, like about early last year, Greenhouse was trying to figure out how they're going to get GDPR compliant on their analytics warehouse. And one of the things that was also the driving factors for the whole logical decoding aspect of pulling data was to be able to deal with hard deletes of the data. And that is something that we were able to clearly provide on the collect side. But once the data was in the analytics database, we wanted to get to a point where we're kind of proactively anonymizing data, so that it was actually very easy for Greenhouse to be able to comply with the right to be forgotten rule. So when this kind of requirement came along from Greenhouse, we actually worked with them pretty closely to kind of get to a point where even data that was coming from their kind of APIs from different tools like Salesforce and the Zendesk and Jira, we are able to actually anonymize, all using the same kind of materialized view framework to then allow them to be kind of compliant to the right to be forgotten rule. Aaron, you want to add to it?
Yeah, no, I think it was around May last year that this was happening, and I think that we wanted to do everything that we could to be compliant, and I think that one of our big worries was like, well, if we collect all this data in our data warehouse and don't have like a easy way to propagate the deletes, that would be a big exposure point for us, and so we wanted to make sure that we're able to handle that. So we, as Raghu mentioned, we worked with, and I think when we brought this up, this wasn't necessarily top of the roadmap for DataCoral, but I think as we spoke about it more, I think it was clear that it would be a big piece for any company that wanted to remain compliant, and so we worked together to figure out, well, how do we move from the current implementation that we have to one that will be compliant. And so we were able to get there. And I think that was, a big win for us. And we were able to make our legal team happy in saying that we do comply and propagate those deletes.
And anything else that we should cover before we close out the show?
I think I just wanted to thank Aaron and Greenhouse again for the patience that they've had as we have kind of grown. We believe that it's a kind of customer that any startup could kind of dream of. It's been like a really great kind of experience kind of working with Greenhouse. So we kind of look forward to working with them closely going forward.
Yeah, the other thing, I mentioned that we worked with Periscope data as our BI tool, but that was a number of years ago. And the current BI tool that we work with is Mode Analytics. And I think we've been super happy with Mode as kind of the primary window onto our data warehouse. And this is actually an interesting use case that we have. Metabase is a open source BI tool. And so DataCoral provides a Metabase slice. And so basically Metabase is a really it's a pretty powerful BI tool where you can write SQL queries against your data warehouse, your Redshift instance, and see the results in the browser, which is obviously what a BI tool does. But I think that what we discovered in rolling out Metabase is that it was a little rough around the edges for something that would span the entire company. And so we decided to keep Metabase as like an internal tool for our engineering team, for our data scientists to kind of prototype queries. But we decided to not roll it out across the entire company. And the other part of that is that right now, the way that Metabase is organized is that it's kind of has relatively blanket access to our Redshift database. And so anyone who has access to Metabase, which is a small subset of people, have access to a lot of data. And that's good and bad. I think it's good because it allows us, again, to prototype some of these queries. But we obviously don't want everyone at the company to have access to every piece of data. And so what we've been able to do, again, using materialized views, is we transform subsets of data into specific schemas in Redshift, and those are the schemas that we give Mode access to. And so another piece of this is that we don't transfer PII or PI to the schemas to which Mode has access. So again, that's kind of like another layer of security and compliance, is that we are able to use materialized views to sanitize the data for more public, by public I mean within Greenhouse, of course, more public consumption. And so that's a kind of another interesting use case that we've found to be a pretty big win for us here, is that we can do that and sleep easier at night, knowing that we don't have to have everyone have access to all the data, which is, I think, probably a worry for a lot of people.
Yeah, again, the fact that Metabase is something that gets deployed inside of your VPC means that it is kind of only accessible through your VPN, kind of adds to that security.
Exactly. But again, that's not everyone has access to our VPN. Like the customer success team, isn't logging on to the VPN, like our engineering VPN. So that was another reason why we didn't roll it out across the company, because the technical hurdles were too great.
All right. Well, again, thank you both for that. For anybody who wants to follow up with either of you, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so, as a final question, I'd just like to get each of your perspectives on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today. Aaron, starting with you.
It's a good question. I think this is actually a piece that maybe I would have touched on before, but we didn't get into it. But I think the thing we're seeing more and more is having our customers demand real-time data as opposed to, or close to real time, and so the idea of either providing that data through these data dumps like once a day or every hour are becoming the idea that you could transform and stream data in real time is definitely something that people want. But I think the tooling is still complex, to get data out of a production system and maintain it and send it in real time. I think we're getting close, but I think I'd like to see that. And I think that's something, again, that I've talked with Raghu a lot about, and I think DataCoral is thinking about it as well. It's like, how do we if we're leveraging logical decoding to pull all the changes that are coming from our Postgres database into our data warehouse, are there kind of efficient ways to hook into that to transform it in real time?
And Raghu?
From my perspective, I just find kind of the biggest gap is in complexity of the whole kind of tool chain that's there across like all kinds of functionality that is needed for data management. And it's still very hard, even though there's quite a lot of options, it's actually pretty hard for any one company to be able to say, okay, now I know exactly what the right end-to-end toolkit needs to be like. We are doing a little bit to help standardize tooling for end-to-end data flows, but as more and more companies have lots more data and lots more kinds of use cases, I only think that there's going to be a problem that will keep increasing, where there are more and more options, and each one does like a small sliver of what you need, and now it's up to you to actually put them all together yourself. And I think that's something that we are trying to put a dent into.
All right. Well, thank you both again for taking the time today to talk through your experiences. It's definitely valuable to get some sort of insight into the ways that different people are running their engineering and managing their data platforms. So I appreciate the both of you taking the time today, and I hope you each enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias.